Hello there. As you probably can read from the title, we will be talking about the Rejected, a Wayward Drums lore book. Now, if you want to read this story by yourself, it will be in the description below. So, yeah. But before we get to reading, I want to establish how I will be determining how good the story is. In my view, lore books have three general guidelines. One, does it to tell us something about the world, meaning it gives us information that is in the game world we are playing, or is a part of. Two, what we will read in the lore book will be representative of what will appear in the game, meaning what is in the story will be present in the game, whether that is a character, faction, place, or an idea. Now, both of the first 2 points are related, but the difference is point 1 is more akin to world building, and point 2 is more akin to interactable world building. The third point is how good is the story. Now, that is fairly subjective, but I think it is more akin to how well it accomplishes what it sets out to do. So, how does the book do on point 1? Alright, I would say. Not as well as the previous books. The story focuses on a much more narrower topic than the ones covered before. While that isn't bad, it certainly tells us less. We don't know much more about the general world or anything else, but we know a lot more on one very specific topic. And that topic is chimeras and cambions. So what do we learn about them? Not much in the story itself. If you look around on the Wayward Drums Twitter or on the community page for the Wayward Drums channel, you can learn a lot more about them. It's not substantially more, but it gives you an answer of like what their deal is. But in this one, it doesn't really tell us a lot. It doesn't tell us the whys and the hows. It focuses more on their place in the world. The main character in this story is a chimera, but as I said before, we don't know why they exist or how they came to be. Same applies to the cambions. The story is more focused on how they are treated in society, that treatment being poor. Our prospective character at the beginning of the story is supposed to be killed, but isn't due to the sympathy of one sent to kill him. The society portrayed in the book will have you believe that chimeras are inherently evil. Later on, a farmer calls the main character devil spawn. Yet since the story is told from the chimera's perspective, we know what they are thinking. We can see that their reactions and their responses aren't "I'm evil, I'm a terrible person." It's "oh dang dude, I'm like hungry, I'm like lost, I'm sad, I feel terrible." That's the sort of feeling that we can read in the actual book. And since the book is written from a more like a third person omniscient perspective, because we can see here it felt large rough hands pulling it into the light. Not I felt a large rough hands pulling it into the light, pulling myself into the light. It's clearly from a third person omniscient or at least limited perspective, which is important to know because from that we get that this is an unbiased perspective of the story. Now that does give some issues on like how did we even get the story, because all these stories, these lore books are supposed to be something that you're supposed to interact with in the game, so I'm not necessarily sure how that works, but we'll get to that when we get to that. But from what we know, this story is about chimeras and how they're just like normal, ordinary things, ordinary animals. They want to be in a warm, calm, and kind place, to eat every day and be loved. Yet the society around him thinks that he is just some sort of monster to kill. Again, this gives us a lot of information to us and to the player that the world is hostile towards the creature, that it is by all means just a good thing, no more evil, no more gooder than anything else. And cambions share this idea as well. They are rejected out of society or killed because they look different, even though they are just like every other person. The story goes to great lengths to have us care for them, from the chimera feeling learned lost, and from the cambion giving us a reason to like them. Isaac, the character in the story, who saves the chimera by showing him kindness. And this gives us a lot to absorb, mainly that cambions and chimeras are just animals and people. That's simply it. And this is necessarily important to know because in the game we won't necessarily be interacting, we won't have their thoughts, we won't read their minds unless they're mind reading in the game, but I don't think that's going to happen. What we learn is that they are simply just another creature. And this is important to know, even if it is a very small detail. It is important to know because on how they will interact with the rest of the world. Is it a justified hatred or is it an unjustified hatred, and how does that inform them? But what about the indirected pieces of information we get? In contrast to the prior books, we get very little. A god's name is mentioned again, Aes, and magic is used on hunting equipment. The only other thing of note is the tone. It continues the trend of the other lore books, showing that the world is a grim place, but that was a very obvious because of how the story goes. It isn't a background element as before, but it's more front and center. The only other issue I have is that these books are supposed, and as I mentioned before, supposed to be found in the world. They are written from a personal, historical, or analytical perspective, yet our main character is an animal. They can't write or speak. And since this is from a third-person, omniscient or limited perspective, how are we getting their thoughts? Is the creature's mind being read? Is that what's happening? Again, I'm not necessarily sure what the context is for how this book is even being written, but it could be just simply how it is written, so we can get the perspective from chimeras and whatnot. Again, it's not necessarily something too huge of an issue, but it is something that I need to point out to. And what about point 2? It is really well in my eyes. Both the chimeras and the cambions are going to be in the game, and the cambions are going to be a playable race. So the player through the story will get an idea on how their race is going to be treated in the world, which is very important. And additionally, the Wayward realms will have a reputation system. Now, how the reputation will be in the actual final game is up to it being seen, but this is where it gets a bit interesting. I can't necessarily find evidence of your chosen race in Daggerfall affecting your standing or reputation, but it would surprise me if the cambions didn't have any negative standing or reputation with factions like the Inquisition. In one of the prior stories, we saw what I could assume is a cambion, or at least a fey creature, and cambions would certainly be categorized, at least from the Inquisition's perspective, as fey-like or something, as an evil thing, and they would have a negative disposition towards them. But again, I'm not necessarily sure if that's going to be in the game. I'm just necessarily saying it would make sense if the cambions, as a race as a whole, would have a negative standing with factions like the Inquisition. But again, chimeras and cambions will be a part of the game, at least from what I understand at the current moment. Again, it could change, but from what I know and from interviews, they're going to be part of the game, which is really cool. We get a lot more understanding of the playable race that we are going to get in the Wayward Realms. Now on to the final point. The story sets out to have the reader sympathize with the main character. They accomplish this by showing the Chimera just trying to live a good life, yet they are constantly being threatened and nearly killed for simply looking like what they do. That treatment, coupled with us knowing their thoughts, makes it very easy for the player to sympathize with them. Again, it's a very small point, because you can have someone sympathize with a character very easily by just being like a normal dude being treated very awfully. But what this story does, it does it in such a well-written manner that I think it is accomplished its goal very well. Now, is it particularly original? Not necessarily, but I wouldn't necessarily say originality is that all important, as long as the story is actually well executed. And from the cambions we see, it shows us we also should sympathize with them because they saved our main character. They did a good thing, which means that at least at the starting point we view them in a positive light, which is the goal of the story as it is. Now, again, you can have issues with this, but I think it's overall a well-written and well-executed story. It is a good addition to the Wayward Realms. I hope you'd enjoyed this, and if you did, talk about it, I guess. I enjoy seeing anyone commenting on the videos down below. And yeah.